Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. In this podcast, Robby Soave, Associate Director at Reason, joins Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and me to talk about his new book, Panic Attack: Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. We discuss the disruptive political activism by some millennials, or Zillennials as he calls them, explore the revival of socialism, and he even offers advice to listeners if they find themselves confronted by a woke Zillennial. Thanks for joining us. Robby, you've got a hot new book out, Panic Attack: Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. So you believe Zillennials, which is your term for merging millennials and Generation X, are actually undermining the progressive cause. As a libertarian, you think you may have some common ground with these activists, but you don't always like their tactics. Share with us your thinking about your thesis and some examples of Zillennials shooting themselves in the foot in the first place.
Sure. The thesis of my book is that there's infighting produced on the left when these kinds of radicals that we're seeing causing violence on the streets of major cities or on college campuses, trying to shut down speakers they disagree with or prevent people from coming to campus they disagree with, or tell their professors that they can't talk about controversial subjects in class because they'll be offended or feel unsafe if they do. These kinds of tactics reflect a new kind of progressive leftist approach to activism that is hostile to many of the things progressives used to believe, is hostile to the things that many libertarians used to have in common with progressives. I being a libertarian, they have kind of turned on free speech and due process, which used to be important values of the left. The leftists were centrally involved in the free speech movement at Berkeley in the 1960s, which cast off these really authoritarian restrictions on speech on campus. So the left now hold these values as antithetical to their activism. They do not practice free speech for everyone. Free speech is capable of harming people if you allow people to say things that threatens the safety by impacting the mental or emotional health of people the left is sympathetic to. Then it's like you've engaged in violence. So there have been so many examples, I think, in sort of activist circles where this kind of hostility to open discussion is really counterproductive and self-defeating. I had activists that I interviewed for this book telling me, for instance, that they hated the Women's March, which had the initial one, the same weekend as Trump's inauguration, which had hundreds of thousands of people participating in it. And they're saying, no, we wanted nothing to do with that because there weren't enough sort of trans women of color involved in the planning of it, so this is just like the perfect is the enemy of the good. We didn't have the most marginalized or the most oppressed people, so this activism is no good to us. So this is a purity test that very, 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 very few people could possibly satisfy to be able to participate in what the activists deem as good activism.
So interestingly, you spend some time in your book trying to understand how Zillennials have become so hypersensitive. And you make the case that it's actually their upbringing that's to blame for them being so easily offended, and they're constantly seeking out safe spaces. So how have their parents produced a generation that is, in your words, frightened and less resilient?
So you have to realize that there was a massive cultural shift over the last 20 or so years to change the culture of parenting, of school, of K through 12. I mean, many of the issues I'm talking about in the book, when we're talking about college campuses, safe spaces, etc., I mean, they begin much earlier than that. School sort of changed, or the vision of what school is, has been changing since I think the late 1990s to be about producing feelings of safety to what I might term an unreasonable degree of safety. Often in response to violence that has taken place in schools. I think it's not an accident that the Columbine shooting, which took place at the very end of the 90s, happened amidst a time of tightening laws about having weapons in schools and adding metal detectors and security cameras and actually placing police in schools. If you go back to the 1970s, there was not a single police officer in any school in America. Now there are police officers in like half of public high schools. What is a school? It's like a daycare where we're keeping everyone very, 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 very safe, I think became the prevailing view of school. Even though schools were always very safe places, the incidents of violence that have caught the media's attention and were terrible, are very, very rare occurrences. So that sort of makes the environment of school, I think, different for the people who went through school maybe shortly after I did. And then at the same time, the parenting norms are changing. Helicopter parenting is in some sense not even a conscious choice that parents are making, but something forced on them by our society, by our laws, in fact. You can be arrested, and people are arrested for leaving their kids at home or letting them walk to school, letting them play on the playground by themselves. There's a whole criminalization of giving kids like a level of just basic autonomy that was normal for kids to experience, and indeed probably contributed to them becoming responsible and resilient people. So all of that is happening. We're accelerated tremendously over the last 2 decades. So it's a theory. It's a theory that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff share. Lenore Skenazy, these are people I know and work with. Haidt and Lukianoff are authors of a book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which talks about this, and Lenore Skenazy writes about the helicopter parenting phenomenon and how it negatively impacts the resilience of young people. And they all kind of have this theory that, well, probably this is having some kind of effect on the people, the young people growing up and how they turn out. I mean, what if just, a small number of the kind of people who came through this environment demand, when they become of college age, the same kind of over-the-top, super all over the place protection, safety from harms large and harms small? I think that's kind of what's happening in terms of the cultural changes.
One of the key points in your book is that this concept of intersectionality, which I confess I just learned that term last year. This concept explains a lot of why things are so upside down on college campuses these days, and why Zillennials give so many well-meaning people a big headache. For our listeners who aren't woke, another new term for me, what is intersectionality, and how does it fuel Zillennials and their political activism?
You are not alone in having not heard the term until recently. It's something that a couple of years ago probably very few people had heard, and now is just so in vogue, is just a term that is in your face. It's something the left cites constantly. Activism must be intersectional. If your activism is not intersectional, it's no good. So intersectionality is a theory that came into existence in the late 1980s. It was coined by a sociologist named Kimberly Crenshaw, who was writing about racism and sexism and needed a way to describe that, there are different sources of oppression in society. So if you're a black person, historically black people have suffered racism. If you're a woman, historically women have suffered from sexism. But what if you're a black woman? If you're a black woman, you've had both of these forces of oppression have exerted an effect on you or people like you. And so they intersect. And these are different sources of oppression, but they're related, and also they stack. It's very important that they stack. You can be, you're more oppressed theoretically if you have multiple categories working against you. So there's nothing really wrong with that theory. And that theory is actually kind of self-evidently true. Like, there's not actually a lot to it. But what happened kind of over the subsequent years after the term was coined was other thinkers, sociologists, activists, academics, people in the campus environment added a lot of other marginalized categories for our consideration. It's not just race and sex and gender, but gender identity and gender expression and LGBT status and transgender status and disability status and size and age and religion and national origin, and it on and on and on and on and on. And actually, at many campuses, there are now bias response committees whose job is to investigate and report on and provide a reporting mechanism for people to essentially snitch on each other if any of these categories is impugned or slighted in any way, that you have some right to not have that happen to you. We're talking about very small, saying something that offends someone on one of these grounds. So my issue with intersectionality is that, the more you're saying, you have to agree with me on not just that racism is bad, but sexism is bad, but also these other 20 things. And I don't want to work with you or have anything to do with you unless you're in 100% agreement with me on all of those things, even things that most people find sort of contradictory, like, I have to be sort of for Palestinian rights, but against Israel in this hierarchy. But what about anti-Semitism? That's not included generally among the people who advocate intersectionality. So they want nothing to do with you unless you're on board all these things at once. And I think that's a very short-sighted tactic, because you want to bring people into your coalition around, single issues or important issues. You don't want to turn people away for not agreeing with what the most radical far left person agrees with. And there's all sorts of infighting produced by this, especially because, kind of related to the theory, you're not supposed to question the marginalized. It's not their responsibility to educate you about oppression and marginalization. So, but also they're the sole experts on the subject. So there's no way to acquire knowledge about what the right thing to say and think is unless you already have it. And also you're not, supposed to expect these people to sort of be the leaders on these issues, but also they are the only ones who have the right to be the leaders on these issues, because they are the experts on oppression, the oppressed on each individual category. So it becomes very contradictory at some point, and indeed, I think self-defeating.
I loved this chapter where you go into these issues and you talk about what you call self-cannibalization. And I love the example of, you had there was someone on Facebook asking for help finding housing for a wheelchair-bound neighbor, but yet instead of getting applauded for being a good Samaritan, they were called out as ableist for using the so-called offensive terminology of wheelchair-bound. And yet, as you said, you can't ask someone in a wheelchair for the correct term because it's not their job to educate you. So all of these things really make you want to throw up your hands and just walk away. So in some ways, isn't their ultimate goal forcing good-natured, reasonable people to sit on the political sidelines and let them dominate?
Yeah, I think so. I saw a joke once that I think very well encapsulates a lot of this, that sort of the leftist criticism of like the mother of all bombs being dropped on the Middle East is that we assumed its gender, not that we dropped a bomb on someone. So there's a sort of performative obsession with language and with small grievances that I think is just makes so many otherwise sympathetic people just roll their eyes, like that this is what you're obsessed with, this is what you care about, this is what animates you the most, and you think I'm a bad person if I don't agree with you on this. It's so off-putting, I think, and it's hard to gather coalitions. Like, I'm a libertarian. I share some goals, at least, of progressive people. I share many goals with Black Lives Matter. I think criminal justice reform is very important. I think policing in this country has been racially tinged and having a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. So I agree very much with sort of the progressive line on these things. And so I want to work together on convincing more people to support sentencing reform and things like that. But if they're saying, we don't want to march with you unless, you agree on all these other things, including that pronoun use should be mandatory, or you should be, expelled from campus if you're not agreeing to these words that sort of just appeared out of nowhere 50 seconds ago. That's a bad idea, I think, for social change. But importantly, I think they don't actually see their role as social change so much. These kinds of activists, this is a new sort of development. When you get to the root of their thinking, it's about harm mitigation. It's about safetyism and harm prevention. So it's not really that they're trying to practice these tactics because they think they will convince a lot of people or win sort of intellectual battles in the sort of exchange of ideas, but rather that these are the tactics required to promote the safety and well-being, the emotional comfort of the people they care about, of the marginalized communities. So that's what the impulse comes from.
That leads me to a very interesting observation you make in your chapter. You say that making the cause of criminal justice solely about race, such as groups like Black Lives Matter, may have turned what should be a broadly popular agenda into a fringe crusade. So you argue that today leftism is now at war with liberalism. Wouldn't it seem that the goal for every cause is to have as many followers as possible, especially America's progressives who may be sympathetic to many of their grievances and views?
Right, I think so, and I think that was the case before intersectionality was so influential or so cited in activism. In the book, I talk a little bit about how I suspect that the fight for same-sex marriage was perhaps the last sort of pre-intersectional activist cause. In that, yes, the idea was to bring as many people into supporting same-sex marriage as possible. It didn't matter what your other views are. Didn't matter if the activists for same-sex marriage, they didn't didn't have to agree with you on whatever other things you thought. They just wanted you to agree and recognize that, you know what, these laws should be equal. You don't have to, it doesn't have to impact anything else, but the same-sex couples should be allowed to get married. And they made the argument like narrowly tailored to bring in sort of conservative or even religious inclined people, the majority of the country, to think that, they just want the same kind of family situations, that they're no different from you, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very non-radical message and it worked. And gay marriage is legal everywhere, and it grew in popularity tremendously in a short amount of time. Now, under the sort of influence of intersectionality, it's all about achieving all the more radical aims all at once, even if, we don't even agree or they're in tension with each other. And so I'm concerned for, Black Lives Matter groups, if they're talking about criminal justice reform, well, some of their policy goals I support, but then you see that they're also saying, but we also must take down capitalism because capitalism is the root of racism, which is impossible because racism predates capitalism, so it cannot it cannot possibly be the cause of racism. But all these things as well. I mean, there was a Black Lives Matter group that shut down an ACLU speaker at William and Mary, I believe. I read about it in the book, because they shut down the ACLU because they were mad at the ACLU for supporting the rights of everyone, supporting the free speech rights of everyone, which is what the ACLU has historically done. They have this ironclad commitment to free speech, but they were saying, no, we reject your liberalism, we reject your free speech rights, we want rights just for our allies. And that's a very off-putting message, I think.
Reading your section on cultural appropriation, I think most people would probably shake their heads at some of the things they read in that chapter. You share some anecdotes from one from Oberlin College, where the cafeteria was accused of cultural appropriation for serving, quote, culturally inauthentic Asian cuisine. And here in California, you cite an example of a black woman student at San Francisco State who beat up a white male student for appropriating dreadlocks as his hairstyle. So based on these examples, can we conclude that the adage of America as a melting pot of cultures and ethnicities is really an outdated concept on our college campuses today?
It is to some degree, because identity is what matters, and identities should be distinct. And there's a activist tendency to be very protective of identity and the concept of identity. So whereas, people, and of course this is bad in that this is not how things work, it's good when cultures blend and mix and you get different clothing and foods and traditions that are sort of a jumble and oftentimes improved upon. And this brings people together. It's good to have different cultures participating in each other's traditions. It promotes understanding and tolerance and multiculturalism and lessens sort of racism. And when we don't understand, when we otherize other cultures, then that's when we're more likely to have disagreement, violence, warfare, if we're talking about it in a sort of civilizational context. But this has really, the activists have come to the view that no, on Cinco de Mayo, only sort of Mexican people should be participating in the culture of Cinco de Mayo, even though Cinco de Mayo is not even really celebrated in Mexico. It's actually more commonly celebrated in the U.S. So it's just it's a sort of backward and not a good understanding of how cultures intermingle. But it's become very influential. It's just taken for granted now in progressive circles that, of course, you wouldn't let your daughter dress up as Moana unless you're of Polynesian descent, which is to me quite crazy. And I think most people would reject that. But the ardent progressives, that's unquestionable dogma.
In your chapter on the rise of democratic socialism, you write about, quote, the tree of Zillennial progressivism and its many branches: racial oppression, violence against women, the erasure of trans identities, and so on, and its roots in anti-capitalism. Explain how Marxist thinking, especially in universities, is really at the heart of the various leftist movements you talk about in your book.
Right. So the new left, which is now the old new left, this is the left we're talking about in like the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. They were so inspired by Marxist thinking and by class and economic inequality. This remained very influential on university campuses where you had so many people thinking and teaching from a Marxist perspective, or applying a Marxist economic struggle sort of lens to all matters of academia, to all sorts of areas of study. That started to fall by the wayside a little bit as sort of the other intersectional categories of identity became more popular among students, I think, who wanted to study these subjects. So then you get things like African American studies, LGBT studies, women's studies, that are all very much teaching a kind of far left activism, but are more fixated on these other categories. So there's actually a little bit of a tension between sort of a kind of Bernie Sanders left that is more old school in its Marxist framework, in thinking that the most important thing is class struggle, economic inequality, that these other things are important, but the root thing we need to change about society is class, which is the explicit Marx idea. That's Karl Marx's idea. And there's a little bit of a tension between that and the newer post-intersectionality left, which is just more interested, I think, in the other categories of oppression. Now, of course, there are people on the left who talk about both of these things very well. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the kind of leading spokesperson of democratic socialism, other than Bernie Sanders, she blends these traditions quite well, I think, from an advocacy standpoint, and in talking about how it's, capitalism is the kind of cause of exploitation, and we need to be very focused on economic inequality, but also we're paying attention to climate change, and we're paying attention to racism and immigration and things like that. So it's interesting, but the focus in the last 30 years has been less explicitly class-based than the older kind of school of Marxism, which survived predominantly on college campuses.
Let's talk about Title IX. I literally stood up, even though I was alone when reading your book, I literally stood up and cheered out loud when reading your chapter, because you bring up one of the cases at my alma mater, USC, that I thought is one of the worst cases of injustice involving former kicker and, most importantly to me, the hero of the 2017 Rose Bowl, Matt Bormeister, who went through a crazy situation involving hostile treatment and denial of his due process rights, and it ultimately ended up in he's not at USC any longer. So can you share some examples of how colleges and activists are using Title IX to the extreme, and what can really be done to both protect victims and restore the due process rights of the accused on campus?
Sure. So Title IX, of course, is a federal statute that mandates equality of gender in education. You can't discriminate on the basis of sex. Universities, schools can't discriminate on the basis of sex. What happened under the Obama administration, the Education Department, or a sub-agency thereof, the Office for Civil Rights, began interpreting the statute very broadly and asserting that it required schools to do much more to police sexual misconduct. So they were saying sexual misconduct is a form of sex or gender-based discrimination. And they said that you had to be much more serious about preventing it, that you had to essentially define it as any conduct that is unwelcome really for any reason. If we're talking about in the private sector, the court has said, well, this has to be behavior that is repeated, that has to be pervasive and severe and offensive to a reasonable person. There are all these qualifiers so that not everything counts as harassment. Those qualifiers have not been in place in college campus for a good 10 years. And what happened is that it became so easy to accuse anyone of violating Title IX and having a sort of kangaroo court procedure take place. So this impugned speech and due process speech, because you could be teaching a subject and talk about sex or gender in a way that bothers or offends some student, and they could file a Title IX complaint against you. It happens all the time. It's terrifying. It's academic freedom out the window. So there has been a tremendous chilling of speech, of uncomfortable or controversial speech, because you only have to offend one person and they will go after you for it. And indeed, activists weaponize Title IX to an unbelievable degree. I mean, there's an activist group where the founders of the organization have the Roman numeral 9 tattooed to their ankles. It was so important to them. And then the due process concerns are probably even stronger, or they're more serious concerns. It has become so easy to accuse someone of sexual misconduct, of behavior, of assault, and this will be adjudicated under standards that are just make a mockery of the principles of justice, again, often required by the Office for Civil Rights, saying that we're going to use a preponderance of the evidence standard. We are going to discourage cross-examination. We're not going to require lawyers. We're going to recommend that a single investigator decide who to talk to, produce some report, and then recommend a finding. I mean, we're not even going to have a hearing anymore. Just kind of farcical proceedings that administrators, took with and ran to the widespread detriment of due process. Bohrmeister's case is a great one. There are so many others like it. Young men who because predominantly it's young men who were accused. Often it's athletes of color. There are tremendous actually racial implications for these accusations that progressives would rather not talk about. But you had people being accused, often after sexual encounters that began consensually and involved copious amounts of alcohol and then became confusing and nobody remembers what happens. And then a year later, someone is filing a complaint and then the university is adjudicating this matter, which is just impossible to do because no one really knows what happened and it was not ideal and there was some wrongdoing on both sides, but there shouldn't be enough evidence here, and yet we're finding the person guilty, we're removing them from campus, and we're ruining their lives over this sort of believe the victim mentality. And there were even cases, I think actually Bohrmeister's is one, where the supposed victim did not make a complaint, but the university said, well, we have to investigate all under Title IX, all sort of any understanding that maybe something has gone wrong. So even if someone else says that you're a victim and you say I'm not a victim, well, the university says, well, we have to decide that. And so there have been cases where the university is deciding whether an interaction that both the accused and the victim think is not an issue, that there was no sexual misconduct matter here, and the university is deciding, well, we've decided there is, and we're going to punish you. And these were just absolutely crazy. 100 lawsuits have been filed against universities for handling these proceedings this way, where the accused student won. And of course, in some cases, they were probably guilty. But the proceeding was so unfair that, when a court looks at it, they go, you can't do this. This is insane. So the one sort of silver lining is that the Trump administration did rescind some of the bad Title IX guidance, and the new guidance is a lot better. However, I'm skeptical that the university bureaucracies will actually change course, most of them, because the new guidance does not say you can no longer do it this way. It's just saying you don't have to do it this way. So that's the good and bad news.
So as we close, some of our listeners may find themselves a victim of hostile treatment from a woke Zillennial, whether on the street or in the workplace or at an event, college campus. What advice do you have for good-natured people on how to make sense of this political movement? And even more important, how can innocent people avoid being drawn into or diffuse a heated discussion with a Zillennial, or heaven forbid, become a victim of a violent incident?
Well, they should order my book. They should go online and get a copy of my book. And then they should be very cautious about saying anything on social media, because we've talked a lot about college campuses, but this mentality has spread to the world of social media predominantly, where there's a culture of canceling people for things you said in the past that were wrong or are now problematic for some reason. So be very careful about entering any heated online discussion or subjecting yourself to a position where the villagers are going to pick up their pitchforks and come for you next. I will caution that, while I'm talking about activists, not all young people. This is not a generational problem as much, because most young people are not like this. We're just talking about a few very loud, influential people on college campuses, but they don't represent the entire generation. So, most young people are thoughtful and interested in ideas, and it's just a couple people we need to be more concerned about and discuss how we're going to prevent them from totally warping our entire culture into being against free speech.
Well, finally, our tradition here at Next Round is to ask our guests to share their recommendation for a favorite beer or wine or adult or other beverage that you would encourage our listeners to try. So after discussing these heavy topics and to celebrate, hopefully, the successful launch of your new book, what are you drinking these days that you recommend our listeners try?
Well, I'm drinking a lot of Malbec red wine, but I will recommend a summer cocktail. My favorite is a blackberry old-fashioned. They are delicious, and especially this time of year for the hot July and August months.
Thanks so much, Robby.
My pleasure. Great talking with you.
Special thanks to our guest, Robby Soave. And if you're interested in reading his book, Panic Attack, it's available on Amazon.com. If you're in the San Francisco area, join us for a luncheon with National Review's Andrew McCarthy on August 14th. Details on our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/pacificresearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.